Some words are whispered, because if they're heard, the whole system might fall. The hallways of Brookhaven High were buzzing as usual, but for Marcus Reynolds, the world was quiet. At 17, he had perfected the art of staying unseen. Black, smart, and sharply observant, he had long known that in a mostly white school, invisibility could be a shield. He didn't act out. He didn't draw attention. Because here, to be noticed was to be labeled. And once they labeled you, they never saw anything else again. But silence can't hold forever. On an otherwise uneventful Tuesday afternoon, Marcus was delivering files to the assistant principal's office. He paused at the door. It was open just enough. Inside, he heard the voices of the school superintendent, the vice principal, and a teacher. At first, it was mundane administrative chatter. But then the tone shifted. "You know," said a voice, "some of these kids, they're just not built for structure." A pause. "What kids?" someone else asked. "You know exactly what I mean." Then came the laugh. That laugh. The kind that isn't humor, it's permission. Marcus didn't hesitate. His hand shook as he pulled his phone from his pocket. He opened the voice memo app and hit record. That recording wasn't just a string of words. It was a breach in the dam. A moment that tore back the curtain on everything he'd suspected, everything no one had dared to say aloud in the light. The institutional racism, the coded language, the policies that somehow always punished the same students, and the willful silence of those in charge. A week later, the audio surfaced online. It didn't take long before the entire community was in an uproar. Parents, teachers, students, it went viral in less than a day. But the school board didn't hold a press conference. They didn't issue an apology. They came for Marcus. He was suspended for unauthorized surveillance. Then, in a shocking move, the school district filed legal charges. Illegal recording, defamation, damage to institutional reputation. They never questioned what was said. Only who had dared to expose it. And now, Marcus stands in court, alone. No lawyer. No representative. Just a black teenage boy standing against an entire system. He isn't a troublemaker. He's not some reckless activist. He's just a kid who pressed record. Because no one else would. Microphone, they told me I broke the rules, but what about the rules they break in silence? When truth is treated like a threat, ask yourself, what are they trying to protect? The courtroom lights buzzed faintly above Marcus as he stood behind the defense table, alone. His sneakers squeaked slightly against the floor as he adjusted his stance. In front of him, seated with pristine posture and briefcases at the ready, were 3 attorneys representing the Brookhaven School Board. Each wore the same expression, half annoyance, half disbelief. Judge Eleanor Price adjusted her glasses and glanced down at the docket. Marcus Reynolds, age 17. Representing himself. She looked up. "You're sure about that?" Marcus nodded. Calmly. Quietly. "Yes, Your Honor." In the gallery, a few people chuckled under their breath. He could feel the weight of their eyes, some pitying, some judging. But Marcus had made peace with it. The truth he carried was louder than their laughter. The prosecutor, Mrs. Donna Wexler, stood. Her voice was clipped, professional, and ice-cold. "We're here because the defendant willfully and illegally recorded a private administrative meeting involving school personnel. He then disseminated that recording, causing damage to reputations and creating an unsafe learning environment through misinformation and public outrage." She paused, letting the words settle. "We are not here to discuss race. We are not here to discuss context. We are here to address unlawful behavior, behavior that cannot be tolerated, even under the guise of social activism." Marcus looked straight at her. "Isn't it interesting," he began slowly, "how the law shows up so quickly when a student breaks the silence, but stays asleep when teachers break students?" The gallery stirred. He continued. "That recording wasn't a hack. It wasn't a deep fake. It was their real voices. They're real words. I didn't make them say those things. I just refused to pretend I didn't hear them. Judge Price raised an eyebrow. Mr. Reynolds, if you wish to make an opening statement, now is the time. Marcus stepped forward. His voice steady. Controlled. But there was fire under the surface. Your Honor, the truth is not defamatory. The truth is not illegal. The truth is what this court should protect. What I recorded was a conversation that revealed deep-rooted prejudice in a school that claims to value equity. I didn't record to embarrass anyone. I recorded it because if I didn't, no one would believe me. Not here. Not in this school. Not in this town. He paused, then looked directly at the jury. I'm not on trial because I broke a rule. I'm on trial because I broke their silence. The silence that followed was thick. Mrs. Wexler glanced sideways at the school attorneys. One of them shifted uncomfortably. Marcus sat down, heart pounding. He knew what he had just done. He hadn't just defended himself. He had declared war on the assumption that kids like him should know their place. He wasn't just a student anymore. He was a witness. A whistleblower. A threat. And for the first time in his life, the room wasn't ignoring him. It feared him. Some walls are made of brick. Others are built with silence. The next day, the courtroom felt different. Not quieter, heavier. Tension floated in the air, settling like dust on every surface. The kind of tension that builds when too much truth enters a space designed to suppress it. Marcus sat still, scanning the jurors. Their faces were neutral, but he knew neutrality often masked discomfort. He could tell which ones had already decided he was guilty, not because of what he'd done, but because of what he represented, a young black boy who refused to bow, who dared to confront authority on its own turf. Across the aisle, the school board's attorneys whispered furiously among themselves. They had not expected Marcus to speak with that kind of clarity or that kind of confidence. Today, they were adjusting. Your Honor, said Prosecutor Wexler as she stood, we call our first witness, Principal Howard Lanning. Lanning took the stand in a well-fitted grey suit, his voice calm, rehearsed, authoritative. He spoke of policy, of privacy, of the need for professional boundaries in school settings. He described Marcus as a respectful but emotionally reactive, academically capable but socially withdrawn. It was a familiar tactic, build the profile, not of a criminal, but of someone who could be trouble. Marcus watched him carefully. Then, when it was his turn to cross-examine, he stood with slow deliberation. Principal Lanning, he began, you mentioned that I was academically capable. Did I ever receive disciplinary action prior to this incident? No, Lanning admitted. And yet you chose to label me as emotionally reactive. Can you tell the court what behavior led you to that conclusion? Lanning hesitated. You often seemed distant. Non-participatory in school events. Marcus nodded, then turned to the jury. I sat at the back of the room. I read during lunch. I listened more than I talked. In this school, that makes me suspicious. But what if I was just surviving? A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Mr. Lanning, Marcus continued, how many teachers at Brookhaven are black? Lanning stiffened. I'd have to check the staffing records. I have them, Marcus said, lifting a sheet. 2. Out of 64. Wexler objected, but Marcus pressed forward. Let the court understand what this case really is. It's not just about a recording. It's about an institution that punishes students not for lying, but for refusing to live inside one. Judge Price overruled the objection, surprisingly. Marcus sat down. The court moved forward, but the shift had begun. One juror leaned forward more often now. Another no longer scribbled notes but watched Marcus directly. Something was changing. Later that afternoon, Wexler brought in another witness, Vice Principal Janet Coles. Coles was colder, clipped, and visibly uncomfortable. She repeated the claim that the conversation Marcus recorded had been taken out of context. What was the context, then? Marcus asked. I don't recall the full conversation. And yet you're sure it's out of context? She didn't answer. Marcus let the silence sit there. It said more than words ever could. Brick by brick, the wall of silence was being chipped away. Slowly. Deliberately. With every question, Marcus wasn't just defending himself, he was putting the system on trial. And it was starting to show cracks. When the same story repeats itself in different voices, it stops being a rumor. It becomes a pattern. The third day of the trial began with cloudy skies and whispers. Outside the courthouse, a small group of students and community members had gathered with handmade signs. Let Marcus speak. Expose the system. Silence is complicity. Inside, the courtroom tried to maintain its cold neutrality, but the energy had changed. No longer was this just about a school policy or a disciplinary hearing, it had become something heavier, something systemic. The quiet dignity Marcus had carried into the courtroom was now a mirror, and everyone inside was being forced to look at themselves. Prosecutor Wexler called her next witness, a teacher named Mr. Kelly Draper. Middle-aged, white, visibly uneasy. Draper had been in the room during the recorded conversation. He took the stand and immediately tried to distance himself. I didn't say anything inappropriate, he muttered. I don't recall the exact phrasing, but I would never make discriminatory comments. Marcus rose slowly. This time, his cross-examination didn't begin with a question, it began with pressing play. From his phone, he played a short, specific clip. Draper's voice was unmistakable. Kids like that don't respond to structure, they respond to discipline. The courtroom froze. Mr. Draper, Marcus asked, when you said kids like that, who were you referring to? Draper looked at Wexler, then at the judge. I don't recall. I do, Marcus interrupted. You were talking about the students in Ms. Jenkins' fourth period class. That class is 90% black. I didn't mean it that way. But that's how it sounded. That's how it's always sounded. Wexler stood to object, but Marcus had already lowered the volume. He let the silence do what it did best, accuse. Judge Price leaned forward. Mr. Draper, do you stand by that statement or do you wish to retract it? Draper sighed. It was poorly phrased. I apologize if it caused offense. Marcus didn't blink. Poorly phrased ideas don't make it into private meetings unless they're comfortably believed. Later that day, Marcus submitted a packet of disciplinary reports. All anonymous. All verified. The data told a story the staff had never wanted public. Black students at Brookhaven were 3 times more likely to be suspended for insubordination or for disruption than their white peers. It wasn't just about what had been said in that room. It was about a culture. A pattern. A school where silence wasn't just encouraged, it was rewarded. Where speaking up came at a cost, and for kids like Marcus, that cost was everything. In a move that shocked even the courtroom staff, Judge Price allowed the data into the record. Wexler was losing ground, and she knew it. The school board's defense had been built on the premise that Marcus was a rule breaker, a disruptor. But now, it was becoming clear, he wasn't the one breaking rules. He was revealing the ones that had always been broken. And the record, just like the system, was starting to skip. In every system built on silence, there's always someone who chose to whisper instead of speak. The fourth day was different. The judge seemed more attentive. The jury more still. Even Prosecutor Wexler arrived with a tighter jaw and hurried steps. The cracks Marcus had made were no longer superficial, they were structural. And everyone in the courtroom could feel it. But Marcus wasn't interested in theatrics. This wasn't about spectacle. It was about survival, his, and every student who'd been shamed for simply existing where they weren't expected to succeed. Today's witness was someone Marcus had known since freshman year, school counselor Ms. Elaine Porter. A black woman in her early 40s, Ms. Porter was one of only 2 black staff members at Brookhaven. She had always treated Marcus with kindness, but also caution. Like someone walking a tightrope between empathy and institutional loyalty. Wexler's strategy was clear. Use Porter to show that Marcus had outlets, that he didn't need to go rogue. That there were ways to speak safely. Miss Porter, Wexler asked, was Marcus ever discouraged from expressing concerns about racial issues at school? No, she replied carefully. I always kept my door open. And did he ever come to you with complaints? Yes, she admitted. He did mention feeling watched. Misunderstood. And what did you advise him to do? I told him to document his experiences. To speak with trusted adults. To stay calm. Wexler smiled slightly. So he had support. Marcus rose for cross-examination. His voice was softer this time, not out of weakness, but restraint. Miss Porter, do you remember when I came to you last spring? After Mr. Draper told me I talked too loud for a library, even though I hadn't said a word. Yes. You told me to let it go. That escalation wouldn't help. Miss Porter lowered her eyes. I was trying to protect you. I know. But in protecting me, you were protecting them too. The room held its breath. Did you report the incident? Marcus asked. No. Did you follow up on my complaint? No. Did you believe me? Yes. Then why didn't you say anything? Miss Porter looked directly at Marcus. Her eyes glistened. Because I was tired. And because I knew that if I pushed, I might lose the only seat we had at the table. There it was. The truth behind the whispers. A good woman in a broken system, doing what she could, but knowing it would never be enough. Thank you, Marcus said quietly. He turned to the jury. This is what silence looks like. Not because people don't care, but because they've been taught that caring out loud is dangerous. Judge Price didn't interrupt. Neither did Wexler. The weight of the exchange spoke for itself. Marcus sat down. And somewhere in the gallery, a woman in a red scarf, a former student, stood up and walked out. Her sign left behind on the bench read, "He's not just speaking for himself." The counselor had chosen silence once. But today, for the first time, she chose something else. She chose to listen. Some trials don't end with a verdict, they end with the truth finding a voice. The final day of testimony arrived cloaked in stillness. Even the buzzing fluorescent lights seemed dimmer. In the hallway outside the courtroom, a silent crowd had gathered, students, teachers, alumni. Some brought notebooks. Some wore pins. A few held signs. But no one spoke. Inside, Marcus sat motionless. For days of standing alone in the heart of a legal machine designed to intimidate. For days of dissecting power with nothing but logic, calm, and a courage too rare for his age. The world hadn't crushed him. It had noticed him. Today, Judge Price would rule. There would be no jury decision, this was a bench hearing. No public fanfare. No final gavel slam to echo across social media feeds. Just the judge, and the law. But Wexler had one last move. Your Honor, she began, before you issue a ruling, we ask the court to consider the implications of permitting illegal recordings in educational institutions. Regardless of the content, this was a breach of privacy. She turned to Marcus. What kind of message are we sending if we allow students to bypass the rules every time they feel uncomfortable? Marcus stood. Not defiant. Just steady. What kind of message are we sending when we silence students for exposing what's broken? Wexler didn't respond. She didn't have to. Everyone knew the answer. Judge Price adjusted her glasses. The room stilled. Mr. Reynolds, she said, you're not a lawyer. But you've presented this case with clarity, civility, and, above all, courage. This court acknowledges that you violated school recording policy. However, it also acknowledges the undeniable public interest of what you recorded. She paused. "It is the judgment of this court that all charges against you are dismissed." A gasp. Then silence. Then applause from the gallery. Not loud. Not chaotic. Just a soft, rising rhythm of hands, clapping for a boy who had dared to record the truth. But Marcus didn't smile. Because the story wasn't over. As he gathered his things, a bailiff quietly approached Judge Price and whispered something. She nodded grimly. "Mr. Reynolds," she said slowly, "one more item. A sealed envelope was submitted anonymously to the court this morning. It contains a document labeled Observation List, High-Risk Students." The courtroom froze. Judge Price continued. "Your name is on that list. Along with 23 other students. All of them black." Marcus's breath caught in his throat. "It appears," the judge said, "that your recording wasn't the only thing they were keeping." Suddenly, the trial felt like something else entirely. Not the end of a fight, but the beginning of a reckoning. The real impact of truth isn't felt when it's spoken, but when it refuses to go quiet. A week had passed since the ruling. The headlines had faded. The courthouse was silent. And Brookhaven High went back to normal. Or so it seemed. Marcus walked the familiar hallways with a new weight on his shoulders. Not from defeat, but from awareness. Some teachers nodded at him now, as if recognizing a survivor. Others looked away, uncomfortable, exposed. Students whispered his name like it was legend. He hadn't meant to become anything more than a voice, but voices echo, especially when they say the things no one else will. He still had no lawyer. No press team. No campaign. Just that voice. And now, others were starting to use theirs. 3 days after the trial, an anonymous teacher resigned. The next day, a parents' coalition submitted a formal complaint to the school board, citing racial bias in the disciplinary system. Students began organizing. Quietly. Confidently. But the biggest shock came in a brown envelope delivered to Marcus's house. Inside, a flash drive. No name. No note. Marcus plugged it into his laptop and played the single audio file it contained. Recording. "We need to start keeping tabs on the ones who speak too much. Reynolds is one of them. You saw what he did with a phone. Imagine what he'll do next. Same voices. Different meeting. But this time, they weren't talking about students like Marcus. They were talking about Marcus." He paused the audio. Took a breath. Then opened a folder on his desktop. File folder evidence _001. File folder evidence _002. File folder evidence _003. He renamed the new file. File folder evidence _004 or the echo. The trial had ended, but the story hadn't. Because systems don't fall with one blow. They fracture, crack by crack, until the truth finally makes it through. Marcus closed his laptop and looked out the window. In the reflection, he didn't just see a student anymore. He saw something else. A witness. A fighter. A reminder. Not everyone gets to see the echo of their own courage. But Marcus Reynolds did. And this time, he was ready to record everything. Code of Silence is not just a courtroom story. It's a signal. For every young voice told to sit down, be quiet, stay invisible, know this: the silence was never yours to keep. Break it.